My name is Charles Michael Yunker. My highest rank in the Navy was Radarman Second Class, E5. Later I served in the Kansas National Guard and attained the rank of E6. Well, I joined the Navy on February the 19th, 1967. Went to San Diego, California for basic training. Basic training I kind of made out there that became the barracks master at arms, which means I didn't have to do a lot of the marching as everybody else did. The only downside of that is after the barracks was inspected, I was supposed to join the company, my basic training company, wherever they were, somewhere on the base. And the Navy required you, if you're one or two people, you had to run to the place. If you're three or more, you march. Or if you're like an enterprising thief like me, you stole a messenger's bicycle and you pedaled to where they were, and then you ditched the bicycle in the bushes. And I got away with it for 2.5 months or whatever it was in basic training. Just shut up and do what you're told. Kind of expected it, because you'd seen films like war movies from World War II where they cut your hair and all the marching and the drilling and getting yelled at and all that, so you kind of knew what to expect. It's kind of interesting. It's something that I just remembered, that going through basic training, we were marching as a company someplace. We just had dinner, and I'm in the back of the company, and all of a sudden our guy that's marching has stopped us. The word came that filtered down back real quick. Somebody up here wants to see Yunker. No, it was my older brother. He came over and just to see me went through boot camp, and everybody's going, oh, what's that third class? Well, he was a third class electronic technician, and they thought, like, what did he do? And so I had little things like that occur from time to time. My older brother wanted me to put in for brother's duty, and to be honest about it, I lied to him. I told him I did, but I did not. I did not want my older brother being on the same ship, riding home and telling Mom everything that I did or did not do or what have you. So I skipped off that. Well, I remember a lot of the history, which has obviously changed. You're taught things like battleships were named after states, cruisers after cities, aircraft carriers after famous battles, which that's going by the wayside, obviously, and it really wasn't totally true, but you learn things like that, and you learn port, starboard, you learn how to tie some knots, and strangely, we spent one day being familiarized with the M1 Garand. We never fired a round during basic training. So we learned marching. I had gone through a year of high school ROTC, so a lot of that stuff was familiar to me. But it was new to a lot of other guys. A lot of it didn't make sense on the surface, but you realize that they're trying to do is train you to follow orders and the importance of following orders. Things like, well, when they took us out to a range where we put us in a room and threw in some tear gas, and you're supposed to put on your OBA, oxygen breathing apparatus. I think the drill instructors enjoyed doing this because they told us make sure you get a real close shave the day before you go and put that OBA on. Well, give yourself a real close shave and you're just exposing skin to where that gas really gets into the skin and burns. But you learn things like, well, we had one day of, I think we had one day of quote-unquote firefighting. I was disappointed coming out of basic. I wanted to go to a specific area of training, but the Navy sent me straight to the fleet as an aviation ordnanceman to the USS Yorktown, CVS-10, which was at the time in dry dock in Long Beach, California. I arrived at like 5 o'clock in the morning, and it looked like a big factory. There were lights on here and there and everywhere, and it just metal and a lot of noise, and it just reminded me of some kind of a factory. That night, reported on the quarterdeck, and they woke up a personnelman, and he took me down below decks and processed me in and told me, that's when I learned that they didn't have need for me as an aviation ordnanceman, and started giving me my options of what I'd like to try to get into. Fortunately, the Navy in its wisdom sent 18 or so aviation ordnance strikers to the Yorktown, and they only had slots for 15. So I was given my choice of where I'd like to serve, and I wound up in radar, which turned out to be a great thing because I adapted to radar very well, and I think I did a pretty good job as a radarman. Once the Yorktown was out of dry dock, and I might take a sidestep there for a minute, the Navy still hasn't done enough to take care of its sailors when their ships are in dry dock, because that's the worst duty when you have chipping hammers going almost 24/7. The plumbing system goes straight down the tubes, so you're almost like living in an outhouse with the smells and the sounds, and it's just terrible duty, but you live through it. And I wound up going up into the radar and going into CIC. It took a day or two to get used to finding on the size of the Yorktown, finding my way around the ship. One of the guys on the Yorktown, an old salt, told me, you tend to remember the good things and forget about the bad stuff, and it's true. You also remember some of the stuff that's just funny. Like for a while, the Yorktown, at least once a week, would serve us baked chicken while we were in the yards. It was always underbaked, and it wasn't chicken, it was rabbit. I know that because I helped unload the stuff off the trucks onto the Lloyd Thomas, or onto the Yorktown, and you'd go down and see the menu board, chicken, or baked chicken. No, it's rabbits. And it got to a point where their guys weren't eating it. They were throwing so much away from it, they would just, you'd go through and you'd see the menu board there, and it would be blank. They'd have all the vegetables, but they wouldn't have the main entries. Oh, this baked chicken today. We went to, headed for the Pacific in Vietnam in January of 1968. My first night at sea, I wound up being the CIC watch on the bridge for about an hour. And it's the closest I ever came to being seasick. And it's funny to me. I was on the bridge, and there's nothing for me to do. We didn't have any radar contacts, and I was leaning up against the bulkhead and just kind of daydreaming looking out a porthole on a bridge. Very few portholes on the bridge, but there is one right where I was standing. I'm just watching the horizon go up and down very slowly. I'm just kind of daydreaming, and all of a sudden I start feeling nauseous, and I'm like, what the hell? I stood up, and I was fine, but that's the closest I ever came to getting seasick. I never will forget that thought, and that was funny. But about 3/4 of the way there, the USS Pueblo was captured by the North Koreans, and so the Yorktown and its destroyer escorts went lights out, and the radars were shut down except for the Pathfinder, and we went around the northern area of Japan into the Sea of Japan, and settled in the Sea of Japan in late January and throughout February and into early March, if I remember correctly. And it was extremely cold, and a lot of things that you kind of want to laugh about now, but at the time it was miserable. It got up to -13 degrees one day, and guys were taking their foul weather gear off because that was a heat wave. It was usually around 30 degrees or below. It was a very, very tense time. We were barely on station, and we got a flyover by a couple of Russian Bear bombers with their bomb bay doors open. And the Navy scrambled some jets out of Japan, and they bumped the wings and canopies and kind of pushed them out of the area. It was just basically a show of force, and left a couple of bulls in a pasture kind of bluff at each other. There was, from what I understand, there was more traffic of submarines under the water from different navies than there were above, than there were surface ships for a little bit. So this is a very intense time. And that's, I knew a kid on the Pueblo, not very well, but I knew of him. His hometown is about 24 miles east of my hometown. So I feel so very sorry for those guys and everything they went through. But it's kind of a trivia question. Everybody knows that old Ironside, the Constitution, is the Navy's oldest commissioned ship. The second oldest one is the Pueblo. A lot of people don't realize that because we never did decommission it. I remember going through, I went through a typhoon on the Yorktown, went through a typhoon on the Lloyd Thomas. And neither one was fun. We started hitting a bunch of troughs on the Yorktown one night, and we had water coming up over the bow, and maybe a fourth of the way down the flight deck we hit a couple of them. When our first or second night off the coast of North Korea, it rained, it sleeted or snowed every day, and they had us up on the 011 level looking out through some old gun sights with very thick plexiglass on it as low visibility lookouts, because there's no way that anybody could be on. Our normal lookout station was on the 07 level, and it was just too cold to be there, so they set us up on the 011 level, which was 07 level was outside, 011 was inside. And it was so darn ridiculous. By using binoculars, we could barely see the numbers 10 on the flight deck at the edge of the flight deck because the weather was so bad. Like, what are we doing here? And I'm being critical that it's just, I'm sure there was a reason, I just do not understand why. After a while we were, as I said, we were anti-submarine warfare, so flying those type of planes on or off the flight deck. And the poor guys on the flight deck were out there chipping ice off the flight deck constantly. And when you're a sailor, you develop a dark sense of humor. I was aft lookout on the 07 level one night, talking to the forward lookout on the 07 level. We were taking bets on their flying touch and goes, meaning that the plane would land, hit the arresting gear, and then go off up and be launched again. They're just practicing in the middle of a sleet storm, and we were taking bets on which plane would come the closest to sliding off the side of the ship, because it hit the arresting gear and it just started sliding to the port side of the ship. I felt so sorry for those pilots. Their sphincter muscles had to be tighter than anything. And I remember one day we were also, the entire time we were there, we were shadowed by a Russian trawler. And of course the word went out, hey, there's a woman on that Russian trawler. I got a good look at her one day. It's like, whoa. They put me on low visibility lookouts one afternoon, which meant I was on the starboard catwalk up on the bow. The flight deck was like here, and I'm right below it, and I'm looking down, and there's sea snakes that it looked like somebody went into a butcher shop and just took all the sausages and threw them on the floor. That just, if there was one, there were 40 of these dang sea snakes just floating in the water. And that's kind of sobering thought. Do not want to go overboard. That's one of the days when it was actually got up to around 13 degrees below zero. My older brother's ship, we left, the Yorktown left, and my older brother's ship came up to the Sea of Japan shortly thereafter. And in January of 1979, we had a blizzard, or big snowstorm in western Kansas, where I'm from. Now, given a little bit of backdrop, my older brother worked at an ice cream company that my dad worked at, and I worked there all part-time. And you're talking about two guys, my brother and myself, who would go into what's called a hardened room, where they put the new ice cream to freeze it. And it was normally 25 to 30 degrees below zero in there. And we'd spend a half hour in there in t-shirts, stacking ice cream before we really got too cold and went out to take a break. So we're used to the cold. My older brother and I delivered newspapers in a damn blizzard once. So we knew what cold weather was like. But in January 1970, we had this big snowstorm, and I went over, stopped at my brother's house, knocked on his door. He opened it up, and I came in, and I sat down, he sat down. You know, damn, it's cold out there, and both of us at the same time, but not as cold as the Sea of Japan. That ruined both of us. It was so cold because of the water, being over the water, plus the wind and everything else. It was miserable there. Admiral Zumwalt came out with all of his famous Z-grams and started, everybody started growing beards and so forth. I grew one. Then I got to thinking back about basic training, and I had also, while I was on the Yorktown, I went through a 5-day firefighting school up at Treasure Island. I woke up one Sunday morning and they said, "You're it." And I said, "What?" And "You're going up to Treasure Island for 5 days firefighting school. because I was the first guy that they saw when they went into our berthing area. And I'm laying there, so they needed a body, and I was the body, so I went up there to Treasure Island for 5 days of firefighting school, and we wore OBAs. And you want a good seal on that thing. When the Z-grams came out, and I had that beard, and I got to thinking, if we have a fire on board this ship, I want that OBA to seal my face, so I shaved my beard off. And when we left Vietnam, I started growing it again, which we had gotten a new executive officer at the time, and I never will forget. I was going to be processed out of the ship, and we were about 2 or 3 days outside Pearl. And he looked at me and says, "You haven't shaved for a couple days." I said, "Yeah." "Why?" "So I'm growing a beard," which I knew, well, to be honest, I was too damn lazy to shave. I didn't think I had to. I'd shave when I wanted to. And he says, "Nice timing." I said, "Tough." I didn't like him anyway, so. But I wanted to make darn sure if there was a fire on board and I had to wear an OBA that the thing sealed. So from there we went to Vietnam on the carrier, and to North Star, North Search and Rescue, South Yankee Station area primarily. The Tet Offensive was going strong, and then the Tet counteroffensive started. We returned back to Long Beach, California, I believe in late July, early August, and I left the ship there. That I had just I'd gotten off, maybe 2 or 3 months after that. I put in to try to get back onto the Yorktown, but I put my request in too late, so I wasn't there for the Apollo recovery either. As it worked out, I'm glad it would have been nice to be back on the Yorktown, but as it was, like I said, the Lloyd Thomas became family, and put in for Radar A school, which meant I had to go to San Diego, California first to go through basic electricity and electronics school. Well, I had, promotion-wise, I went from aviation ordnanceman to a seaman. I don't remember exactly when I obtained seaman's rank, but it was sometime on the Yorktown. And just as I got into San Diego, when I was in San Diego, I took the Radarman 3rd class test and passed it. And after, I think we were there maybe 2 months, we went up to Treasure Island, California for the Radar A school, graduated there, and got a 6-month waiver to take the 2nd class E5 exam, and I made E5 about 2 years and maybe a month, a few days after I had joined the Navy, which I always felt kind of good about that I went from seaman recruit to an E5 in just over 2 years. And I was stationed on board the USS Lloyd Thomas in Newport, Rhode Island, which I always like to say that I had nothing against aircraft carriers. And I was on a small one, a World War II era carrier. After I got off the Yorktown, I joined the real Navy and got on destroyers. Because the Lloyd Thomas, the destroyer, was more like family because of the smaller the crew. Didn't have so much brass, shine, or salute. And I was stationed on board the USS Lloyd Thomas in Newport, Rhode Island, which at the time was a bit of a disappointment because I wanted to go stay on the West Coast. And the Lloyd Thomas was in ROS, And I asked a guy that I went to radar school with, he was also stationed on board to Lloyd Thomas, but he arrived a day or two before I did. And I asked him what the hell is ROS, and he just smiled. He says, that's the first thing I asked, is reduced operational status, meaning we kind of moved once in a while so they could scrape the, dredge the coffee grinds out from underneath the ship. Well, I wasn't thrilled that we were in ROS and thought, what are we going to do? We just kind of sit here and rotate and not do anything. Then we had a change of command. Commander Anthony came on board, and he was bound and determined to get us to Vietnam. And he drilled us pretty hard, and the ship worked hard to get out and get qualified for everything so we could go. But I went home on Christmas leave in 1969, and when I came back we had a new captain, Leo Brown. Apparently Commander Anthony had a nervous breakdown, and they had to take him. I liked the guy, but it got to him, and they had to take him off the ship, and that's how we wound up with Captain Brown. And from there we went to Guantanamo. We did get transferred out of our ROS into full operational status, and we went to Guantanamo Bay for refresher training. Taking a step back from that for just a bit, while we were doing our various sea trials and such, I started having eyesight problems. And I went to the eye doctor, and he put me in bifocals, of all things, and wrote up a recommendation that I be given shore duty and out of radar, or out of working in a CIC because it was so dark, it was straining my eyesight. And I reported that back over and gave the letter to our ship. We were getting ready to go to Guantanamo Bay for training down there. And I was asked if I would stay on board the Thomas until we got through Gitmo, because I was in charge of running the surface search. And I agreed to do that, no problem. In the meantime, two of the more enterprising radarmen on the Lloyd Thomas, one of which is here, they had taken it upon themselves. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself a bit. At one point, when we were ROS, reduced operational status, they told us the budget for CIC was something like $30 or $13. It's some ridiculous amount. And that's what we were supposed to use Surfmart to buy our supplies with. And I remember a couple of us sitting there, and we said, forget it, we'll just steal what we need, which basically we did. And we spent a lot of time over at Navy Salvage gathering things that we could use and so forth. And among that, these two enterprising guys, I don't know what their motivation was for why they thought about doing it. They picked up 2 5-gallon cans of white paint that was so old the pigment was stuck down on the bottom of those 5-gallon cans. And I walked into CIC one day, and they were in there pulling this paint up by hand. It was like having a giant taffy pull. And one of the two guys' dad worked for Sherwin-Williams in Hartford, Connecticut, sent him down a little bottle of blue pigment, and they mixed that blue pigment in with that white paint, and they painted CIC a kind of powder blue. Well, we went down to Guantanamo and went all through that. And usually CIC is a dark gray because you need to keep it dark and so forth. It's filled with little white pen lights or red lights, and that's why it caused my eye strain. But when we got through Guantanamo, I realized I didn't have an eye strain anymore. That light blue paint made it light enough to where you could see, but dark enough to where it didn't interfere with our radars and so forth. And about a year later, we're off the coast of Vietnam, and Captain Brown, Leo Brown, the captain of the Lloyd Thomas, came in to have coffee one night and was standing around at CIC, and I was thinking about that paint. And I said, "Sir, I'm not supposed to be here. Can I walk? Can I go home now?" And he said, "Sure." Start walking, but that pad of blue paint kept me on board the Lloyd Thomas. Where did we begin? Slept aft. When we were on the gun line, it was not, well, whenever we're firing the guns, when they fire, we slept in the, our berthing area was one deck below, and was part of the barbette of the aft mount went right through our sleeping compartment. So whenever they fired the aft gun, we didn't sleep much. The food was pretty good. I'm bouncing around, but one of the things my older brother told me to do when I was in basic training, flunk the first exam. Trust me, flunk the first exam. Okay. I will flunk the first exam and I will kill him if it turns out wrong. It's a good decision. While all of my guys in my boot camp company were in the scullery for 1 week, scrubbing pots and pans and buckets or trash cans, I'm in the remedial class over here, the dumb guys going, "Yup, yup, yup." I'm out sitting there watching these guys get stinking dirty, scrubbing the scullery, and I'm learning stuff that I already knew. I escaped somehow or another, did not have to pull mess deck duty on the Yorktown, did not have to do it on the Lloyd Thomas until I walked into CIC one day, and they're all sitting there smiling at me. I said, "What?" And they said, "Guess who's got mess deck duty?" I don't know. They said, "You do." I looked at my second class crow. I said, "I don't think so." They said they went through the entire operations department's personnel records, and I am the only person who never had to pull mess deck duty. And I said, "That's right." And they said, "Well, you've got it." I said, "The hell I do." And then they flipped the badge. I was mess deck master at arms for like 3 months. Total skate duty. All I had to do was make sure some guys did their job, and the rest of the time I sat on my collective butt and didn't do much of anything. Which kind of reminds me of it's kind of an interesting story. When somebody comes straight from the fleet or they're new, even whatever division they come into, every division has to supply somebody to work the mess decks, wash the tables down, sweep and mop and all that stuff. They don't. The cooks do the cooking. The mess deck guys do the dirty work. And we had it set up that you work 2 days, you worked 3 days, and then you had 2 days off. Well, some kid came in one day and he's got his clipboard and he's reporting, I had to sign off on these new. It's okay. He says, you got to do, you're working here today and tomorrow, then you got the weekend off. He worked 2 days. He had Saturday and Sunday off. And Monday, he came in and he's got his clipboard again. And so they find something for you to do. He says, no, I'm getting out. Well, I thought he was getting out of mess decks. I said, yeah, what are they going to have you do? He said, no, I'm getting out. What do you mean? I'm getting out of the Navy. I said, you just got in the Navy. I mean, you're just out of basic training, boot camp. How are you getting out of the Navy? I can't relate. I was, what do you mean you can't relate? I can't relate to the Navy. And I said, you're standing on a deck. We used to call that a floor. This thing behind me here is now a bulkhead. It's no longer a wall. That's not a ceiling, that's a overhead. What the hell is there to relate to? I went to see the chaplain this weekend, and I can't relate to the Navy, and I'm getting out. The kid got out of the Navy. This is when the draft was still going strong. I don't know who his dad was or who he knew, but he got out of the Navy. And I'll never will forget that. I can't relate. That afternoon I was walking down the midships passageway and the captain happened to be coming the opposite direction. Good afternoon, Captain. Good afternoon, Yunker. We passed us. Oh, sir, by the way, I can't relate. Can I go home now? Shut up, Yunker. Oh, I said the wrong thing, and I knew it, and I just kept on walking. I don't know what or how that kid got out of the Navy, but I'll never, I can't relate. So you never know that a lot of strange things went on. My job when we fired, I was the guy that spoke to the spotters. A typical gunfire mission, they'd come over and they'd at a target, and they give you like 6 numbers. They give you the grid coordinates, which was 4 sets of numbers, and each set was like 6 numbers, and you give it right back to them. And while I'm plotting that on the board, Dan Stackett and John Marvin will be over on the TRT looking at the charts, and they're figuring out the gun target line and the time of flight. So I'd go over gun target line 295 time 18 means bearing 295 and 1/8 time of flight of the round. And whatever the spotter says, I have to say, and it was so precise that, or had to be required to be so precise, whatever he said, I said. If he said gun target line, or if I said gun target line 195 time 18 over, I wouldn't be surprised if he came back and said target line 195 time 18 and so forth. It just repeated everything back and forth, precise. In fact, I was, myself or whoever was in my position was the only person allowed to use the word fire. And he would say, like, in a gunfire mission, he would say, ready, break, fire over, ready, fire out, and I would point to an officer and say, shoot. And then when I heard it go boom, I'd say, shot. I had my stopwatch, which I stole from the Navy, I still have. You want it back, come get me. 5 seconds before the time the fight was over, I'd say stand by, splash. And hopefully that's when the round hit and he could do the corrections. We were very, very good, and we were very fast. We had some giant down in the handling room. They were taking he was taking 55-inch pound, or 55-inch 38 rounds, which weighed about 55 pounds each. And he was just taking them like this, shoving them. They would load the round, the projectile, the powder kegs, and buttons were pushed in 3 different locations before the round would leave the barrel. And when we were given something like 1 gun, 5 rounds fire for effect, we would put those 5 rounds out in under 30 seconds, and we were accurate. Probably one of the best compliments you could get is after a mission, you'd have a spotter say, "You mind if we fly over and take a look?" And that was code they wanted to fly over us and take our picture. Well, we got a lot of, "Can we take a look?" There's a couple missions that still bother me. One day this spotter's giving us corrections of left 5 feet, and up 1 foot, over little corrections like that, instead of like 75 feet or whatever. He's giving us single-digit corrections. You're thinking, what the hell do you want us to do? Blow on the dial? We're 13 miles away. You got wind, you got tides shifting this. Apparently he was, and we were successful, that he was, the target was a cave, and he wanted us to put a round inside that cave, and we eventually did. And because they knew there were some bad guys in there. And we found that out later on. Well, we were on the gun line, and I'm sure some of the fellows that you've interviewed have already talked about our gun mount explosion on September the 11th, 1970, where we lost 3 crewmen. And so September the 11th, to a lot of the guys on the Lloyd Thomas, everybody thinks about the Twin Towers. There's several of us on the Lloyd Thomas that we go right back to 1970 on that gun mount explosion, where we lost those 3 shipmates. We probably the highlight of there are a lot of the targets that we shot at. One of the ways back then, we fired a lot of rounds and a lot of support for the 1st Australian Task Force. And the day that our gun mount exploded, the 1st Australian Task Force sent helicopters and medevaced our wounded and then our deceased over to their base in Vietnam, and then from there, after they treated them, they transferred them over to the U.S. medical staff and so forth. So there was a good connection that's there. Our nemesis was the USS Lind. That's where our Commodore was on board in the Lind. We had 3 ships, the Thomas, the Kepler, DD-764s, DD-765 in the Lind. Nobody liked anybody on the Lind. And I asked one of the spotters one day, I says, "Do you ever spot for the Lind?" And he says, "Yeah." "How are they?" So it takes about a half an hour to get them on target. You give them a repeat, and they'll hit Cambodia, Laos, any place but Vietnam. That was kind of funny, but on the, we started receiving, we took on a bunch of ammunition, and we started getting premature blasts. You'd fire them, and they'd get a few miles out and explode in midair. And it's a lot of hindsight. We were like our second day on the line, and everything, some of the rounds are landing, some of them, like I said, are getting a mile or two down range and they explode. Well, apparently, hindsight is, 20/20. Should have stood down and found out what the hell was going on with that ammunition. But I've heard it was World War II ammunition. But apparently when it was, the official word was that there was an O-ring or something missing on some of those rounds. And we're doing this mission and we're firing, getting several, and it was getting embarrassing because I know we were getting like one gun, 5 rounds fired for effect. Well, we might have to fire 8 of them before we knew that 8 of them went out or got on target. And if I remember correctly, I want to say it was like the second round of, or the second command of one gun fire for 5 rounds fire for effect. And I'm standing there, boom, boom, boom. What the hell was that? The first boom was a round that went out. The second boom was a firing, but the boom, boom, that second boom was the gun mount exploding. And it blew the door to CIC open, and I could see right out into the bridge. The whole front of the ship was just a big ball of orange and gray from the blast. And we went to general quarters. Our damage control guys got the fire out in like 30 seconds. Of course, most of it was flash explosion, but the secondary fires were put out. A guy that by the name of Gary Purdy, who's no longer with us, was the damage controlman. He got a medal of some sort. He got in there and was throwing rounds over the sides so they didn't explode. I know that I went over the radio, and I'm kicking myself for this, but I went over in plain language and said, scrub this mission, we just had a gun mount explosion. And for some reason I asked for, said request 3 medevac helicopters. Why I said 3, I don't know. And I don't know if my request was, I don't know if that was also duplicated, because later on we had 3 helicopters come in. But I just remember, I was very sensitive to security issues, and I cannot believe that I actually said scrub this mission. We're anchored a mile off the shore, or 1,500 yards off the shore, less than a mile. And this dummy says, we just had a gun mount explosion. If there was anybody out there that had any idea of shooting at us, we were very vulnerable, and that's always been an embarrassment to me that I actually said that. I cannot believe I did that, but I know I did it. They got the fire out, we got the helicopters on board, they evacuated the wounded first, and they took the 3 fellows off that were killed. and it was very quiet and very somber on ship. We pulled anchor and went off station, and you'd have to ask one of the officers, like Mike Baylog, who's here, or possibly Bruce Woodson if he's being interviewed. I'm not sure how long anymore it was before we got orders to go to the Philippines, and they removed the blown mount there and put a big deck plate over it. And after that was done, we went up to up north and played escort for aircraft carriers, because we only had the one gun mount, and then later we went to Japan and got the gun mount replaced, and we were back in business again. Had a lot of rumors that went around. There was, I don't remember the name of the ship that was, about a year before that, there was a U.S. destroyer that was cut in half by the Australian aircraft carrier, and that the forward half sunk, the aft half was still floating, was towed to the Philippines, where it was scrapped. Evan, I believe so. The word was that we wound up, their Mount 52 became our Mount 51. That doesn't make sense because it was scrapped in the Philippines. We got our new mount in Japan. How can Navy wouldn't have shipped a mount clear over to Japan for later use. That's one of the things that sticks in my craw these days. The captain of the U.S. ship, the Evans, had to take responsibility for that, for two junior officers who did not follow his night orders. And they got, one of them got a slap on the wrist, and the other got some kind of reprimand. But the full sole responsibility landed on the shoulders of that captain, and they tried to pin it on the captain of the Australian aircraft carrier. He was thankfully exonerated. We, the U.S. Navy, made a mistake and turned it the wrong way. But it does bother me about the Navy that I get the Navy Times by email once a day, and there's just been a rash lately of commanding officers being relieved for lack of confidence, which I understand why they don't go into details, but it just bothers me that a lot of good commanding officers have lost their command and effectively lost their Navy career. And they weren't on the bridge. Some junior officers did not listen or did not follow their orders. So, but he has to pay the penalty, and I just don't think that's right. And I know the Navy is hurting for good, qualified surface warfare commanders right now. And it just seems to me that they're trash canning a few good ones, or at least competent ones. You can't expect a commander to be on 24 hours on the bridge. I want to say it was December 27th, maybe the 28th, 1970. A helicopter landed on board, and we took on, I believe, 8 Australian SAS people and a Marine Corps observer. Or he was listed as an advisor, but I was told later by the Australians he was just an observer. And apparently that was the first of 2 such missions in Vietnam of direct cooperation of the Australian Special Air Service and the United States Navy. That evening we went up went lights up, lights off, and we went up into the Saigon River and fired at a few targets, and came back out and anchored in the estuary and took on several more targets. And then the next morning, we inserted half of those Australians on land, where they went on like a 5-day patrol, and the rest of them were helicoptered off of the Thomas, and that was kind of at the end of it. Well, a lot of our shipmates started coming down with Agent Orange issues, and that's back when the VA would only, if your boots on the ground or brown water Navy, right up the rivers and so forth. And I was trying to find proof to help a lot of our my shipmates. So I went to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, got a copy of the deck logs, which I could go on and on for about what deck logs are like trying to read, because I figured it out that there's no set standard on deck logs. It's up to whatever the captain decides goes in the deck logs. Captain Brown of the Lloyd Thomas would not allow anything that was classified in the deck logs, whereas jumping back to the Yorktown, I read those deck logs just out of curiosity at the time that we spent off of the north coast of Korea. And the Yorktown observed sunrise and sunset in the proper Navy manner every day. We were landing and launching aircraft left and right, but all the deck logs would ever say is we launched aircraft, recovered aircraft. Never said the number or the types, because we carried 3 types of aircraft on board. And you're wondering, you would think that they would list how many and the types, but they never did. It just, again, it depends on what the captain of that particular ship will allow in the deck logs. Had I known that back in 1970, when I left the Navy in 1971, I would have swiped the CIC deck log, because if you sneezed, it was in the CIC deck log. But those are discarded after 6 months, and they only go by the deck logs that are kept up on the bridge. Because in CIC we had everything that occurred, time, date, and detail, and so forth. But it took me about 2 years to get the Lloyd Thomas to find proof that the Lloyd Thomas went up that river. Everybody knew it, but it really wasn't listed. So I contacted some of the officers, and through an Air Force friend of mine in Australia, I asked him if he could check with his Australian contacts to find anybody who was on that SAS crew. And he did find a gentleman by the name of John Delgado, who's become a very good friend. John was the guy who, the gentleman who headed up that patrol. And that's why I know it was the first of 2 such SAS troops, as he told me that later. And he sent me a copy of that patrol, which was quite interesting. They heard some shots, they saw some tiger tracks, they found a place where some Viet Cong had been camping, or had been. There was some rice left behind that was still warm, so but they never made contact with the enemy. And the whole reason for their incursion is that our intelligence at the time had indicated there was going to be another Tet offensive, or Tet-type offensive, and that's why the Australians inserted these guys to see if they could find any evidence, and there wasn't, and that didn't occur. But I was able to find the very bottom of one page where we had anchored in this estuary. And well, the truth be known, the VA was really dragging their feet on adding ships to the Brown Water Navy list. And come to find out, through my senator, or I'm sorry, through my congressman, Jerry Moran, who's now Senator Jerry Moran, his veterans guy, it took him about 3 months to find out for me who to contact with the VA to get my ship listed on the Brown Water Navy list and what it took. And it turned out it was one fellow up here in Washington, D.C., who was a U.S. Army corpsman, who told me over the phone that he's learned more about the Navy than he ever knew about the Army. And he was very helpful. He was given a set of guidelines he had to follow. And frankly, they didn't make sense. You would see something like the USS Chicago, which is a cruiser, operated on the Cuvier River. Well, the Cuvier River is, from what I remember, is very shallow, and we were dredging it all the time, only because there was a Marine base up that river, so they were dredging it so they could take supplies up to that Marine Corps group. There's no way the Chicago went in that river, but they used the term operated on the Cuvier River. The Chicago, in reality, because I checked the coordinates, we're about 10 or 15 miles off the coast of that river, firing in. And the VA took the attitude that Agent Orange, that tainted the water and tainted the rivers, the tainted water stopped at the edge of Vietnam and did not enter the ocean. And that's a bunch of hooey. So it was very difficult to get through all of that. I'm kind of jumping around, but it was a very difficult process. Well, when I did find the proof that the Lloyd Thomas had gone up the Saigon River, had anchored in that estuary, he got us on the list, and he got us on the list. In fact, he sent out information to the VA in Massachusetts and the VA in Kansas and told them to honor 2 claims that are even before it was officially on the list. So kudos to him. He really came to bat for some guys on my ship. And unfortunately, well, I used to feel guilty, so, you know, why are all of these guys, I've helped well over 20 guys file for their VA compensation. And I used to feel guilty about, you know, why them but not me. Well, mine was just a little later developed. So I've been hit with 2 different Agent Orange issues, but they came on later. But thankfully through him, he got that on, got us on the list, and that's opened up the doors for a lot of our shipmates. In fact, I was telling my sister coming up here, I was looking at the list of guys who were going to be at this reunion, and exactly half plus me that I know of, because I've helped them file for the VA claims. I've been hit by Agent Orange from that. I had a cousin who was a nurse in the Navy. She was a full-bird captain. She was on the Sanctuary, and we pulled into Da Nang Harbor at one time on the Thomas, and I saw her on deck through binoculars, and would wave, "Hi, Patty," but she didn't see me, obviously. We were in the Philippines, and I'm up in CIC, and all of a sudden the word came down on the 1MC, Yunker, Raymond, second class, Yunker report to the forecastle. What the hell's that about? So I went down, and there's my cousin, full Navy captain, invited me to a party of her with all of her nurses over at Clark Air Base, that they were having a big party. And then a couple months later, shortly after, let's see, would have been after New Year's Eve, because we spent New Year's Eve 1970 in Bangkok, Thailand, and then we went to Hong Kong, and I was in the China Fleet Club with Bruce Winston, who's here this week. Bruce was a ensign, and you know, officers and enlisted weren't supposed to run around with each other or whatever, but Bruce and I once in a while would. Bruce took me over to in Thailand, took me into a jewelry factory and taught me a lot about jewels and stones and so forth, which I bought some rings, and I also bought some loose stones. And I don't recall exactly why Bruce and I met in Hong Kong, but we were both in the China Fleet Club, and I happened to glance over, and across the other side of the room was my cousin Patty with another Navy nurse. And the oddity side of me came out. I told Bruce that, "Hey, look at those two waves over there." He says, "Let's go ask them out." And he just kind of looks at me and says, "I'll take the tall one, you can have the short bald one." And I kind of hustled him over there, and I stood next to my cousin. She had her back kind of like that. I went boom like that and gave her kind of a jab. And if looks could kill, she turned and looked at me and she says, "Oh, hi Chuck, hi Patty." And I never called her Captain, it was always Chuck and Patty. I introduced her to Bruce as Bruce, or Patty, this is my good friend, Ensign Bruce Winston. Bruce, this is my cousin Patty. And Bruce was going, So that's just the honorary side of me. But, those are the good times you remember. I got out of the Navy. I extended I was due to get out in February of 71. I extended for the duration of the cruise, which we got back to Pearl Harbor probably the last week of February, and I flew to Treasure Island, was there for 5 days, translating out, and was discharged sometime, I don't remember the date, in March of 71. Went to my hometown, went back to college, joined the National Guard, served 3 years there, and then I went to work for the Kansas American Legion as their Children and Youth and Public Relations and Children and Youth Activities Director, and became the department, or the state adjutant, which is the chief administrative officer for the American Legion. And that's where I got involved in service officer work, VA claims, and more than my interest. So it's kind of targets of opportunity, so to speak. And I'm very glad that I was in those positions, because otherwise to get the ship on the brown water Navy list, because Congress kept dragging their heels as far as blue water Navy, and now that's all done, but there's been several guys that, well, we've lost a couple, well, we've lost several just on my ship alone. And the whole Agent Orange thing was a mistake that the U.S. government made, which drug their heels as far as acknowledging it and taking care of it. Gave a lot of veterans the same the same feeling that the atomic veterans did. If they put it off long enough, they'll all be dead, and so forth. The Legion, on the national level, commissioned a couple studies that proved a lot of the Agent Orange connections, and that's helped. But then again, it was they still drug their heels about putting acknowledging it. And at one point in time, I read that the VA was following the guidelines of an Australian study, which indicated that the ships that ingested the water and ran it through their evaporators basically eliminated the Agent Orange potency. But it did say, like, that there was some residual effects, but it didn't offer any specifics. And it got down to, well, how many parts per million does it take to kill somebody? And they ignored that stuff. Later, the Australians came out with a second study, which some medical association in the United States also came to the same conclusion, that running Agent Orange tainted water through the ship's evaporators actually enhanced the stuff. And on a ship, just like its fuel before the nuclear, the old fuel oil ships and the ships that ran on JP5 and so forth, whatever ran on organic fuels, they're constantly shifting fuel from one tank to the other to maintain the ballast and balance of the ship. Well, they did the same thing with water. So if you have Agent Orange tainted water in one water tank, you might have it in the next one the next day, because they're shifting water constantly back and forth to maintain balance and ballast. And it could be there, for years.